Okay, thank you very much. Now, the problem with WordPress is that it's slow. Here's my site. Here's my site, and it loads in 0.4 seconds. Or at least, as you can see, the content is readable. It hasn't finished loading by then, not by a long shot. Images, fonts, embeds, all load up and all build up while the user is reading. But the important thing is that the user is reading. And as was said in the introduction, I've got a fairly good PageSpeed score as a result. For those that don't know, PageSpeed is Google's algorithm for working out and measuring how quickly a site loads. So they provide two scores, one for mobile, which you can see at the bottom of the screen there, and one for desktop. Ironically, they want me to fix just one tiny thing. Google want me to fix the JavaScript for Google Analytics. Google, it's out of my hands. So while I've become quite smug and can boast about having a high speed score, the question has to be asked, why is it important? So we know that Google is famously protective of their ranking algorithm. We know they prefer SSL and fast loading sites, but to most of us, it's just the vibe of the thing. So it makes some sense to use what we know, but really even that doesn't matter. Ultimately, Google doesn't really care how quickly a website loads. Their users care, and their users are your visitors. So if visitors to your site were willing to wait 30 seconds for a site to load, then Google would be willing too. Today, I'm going to be focusing on code you can upload. And you know, it can be via FTP, via Git repo, all that sort of stuff. Mainly I'm doing that because servers are hard and can vary in configuration a lot, but also because a lot of quick wins are all on the front end. Themes, htaccess files, and sort of all that sort of thing. And I prefer web page test when I'm testing for performance. It basically presents the data for you to interpret, and you can see the effect that any change you make has on your visitors. And really, it's your visitors that you should be caring about. And many of you in this room might have a personal site, and I reckon that's an ideal place to experiment, make a change, experiment, and just measure the result. Rinse and repeat. And I think web page test is the most convenient tool for measuring the effect of the change because it's pretty much enter a URL and go. And I'm getting double clicks on this. So there's a bunch of locations you can choose from and other settings you can tinker with, as you can see at the bottom of the screen there. But if you're measuring the effect of a change, the important thing is consistency. And one of the great things about web page test is that it lets you compare two tests. One of the early tests I did was to just compare SSL versus no SSL. Above the timelines, they give you a timestamp. Below the timelines, they give you the visual completeness of the page. And so I can see that the SSL handshake was 300 milliseconds. It was actually closer to 200 and a bit milliseconds, but it was the right little bit that it made it look like 300 milliseconds. But they'll also give you, when you first run a web page on a test, they'll give you the key metrics. And these are the ones that I had when I was first trying out SSL, and I've highlighted the ones there that I think are important. And all of those relate to time for the user. Time to start of render, time the document is complete, and time the document is fully loaded. They also provide this as a waterfall. This basically shows you how the browser downloads assets and the timings that have produced the events for the key metrics. So we have the start of render, and when the document is complete, and a number of others in between. But it's time for the terms and conditions, because all this measuring is actually quite useless. unless you have a plan for going in. Because without a plan, it's all a nice idea, but it's kind of like measuring your blood sugar while eating chocolate mud cake. It's not going to get you anywhere. So I think you need to start thinking about performance with design. One of the first things I told my designer was that I wanted a performance site. And while a flat or a flattish site helps, considering the modern web is of far more use. SVG assets, designing for FOUT, designing to work without JavaScript, all of these are the best things at all. And sort of in spite of himself, Ignatius, my designer, is a really good front-end developer too. And I think that a designer with development sensibilities helps. They understand what makes the web work and also what makes the web crawl. So I've just gone through 20 slides. Let's write some code. I did spend so long talking about planning because I think it's important. But having planned for a performance site, let's not mess it up in the coding phase. So I'm going to start with a fairly well-known idea, something that you should all know. Just to recap the obvious. Let's put JavaScript in the footer. If you have a particularly large page on your website, then the JavaScript is going to load last. So say you've got a huge comments thread, then your site needs to work with, without JavaScript. But JavaScript in the footer is, a site working without JavaScript is just a good idea anyway. JavaScript is really fragile and it can just crash at any time. So you will have all seen this, and you've probably regularly used it. Anyone who codes a WordPress theme will have. It loads the JavaScript file the WordPress way. The last line in particular is important. It loads it in the HTML footer. And you've just come to a WordCamp and I've shown you one of the most common WordPress code examples around. So let's move on. Most of you will know WordPress comes loaded with jQuery. Just name it as a dependency and yay, jQuery loads magically. So in theory, because we're doing it the WordPress way, we're doing everything correctly. So let's have a look at what we end up with. Right there, up in the HTML header of the document, there it sits, nice and proudly, jQuery. And to maintain backward compatibility, there's its little friend as well, jQuery migrate. So loading jQuery the WordPress way blocks rendering and it will slow down your site. Which brings us nicely to a rule, the first rule that you can break, and that is to start messing around with WordPress's core JavaScript libraries. WordPress loads jQuery and a bunch of other libraries in the HTML header for reasons of backward compatibility. Back in the day, you could only load JavaScript the WordPress way in the HTML header, and some plugins, ones that haven't been updated for a while or aren't really well written, rely on this. But it is possible to get jQuery to load in the footer of the page. Here you'll notice that I'm adding some data to a script by the name of jQuery core. jQuery core is how WordPress refers to jQuery proper, so without that migrate script. And to load jQuery core in the footer, you just need to assign a group to it, group 1. Group 1's the HTML footer, group 0 means the HTML header. So then when it comes time to loading your JavaScript, you can just refer to jQuery core. This change means that jQuery will no longer block render on your site. So the HTML that we had generated before becomes something more pleasing. jQuery loads in the footer and jQuery migrate isn't loading at all, so you've lost an HTTP request. And if you're handing over your site to a client, this is relatively safe. In most cases, the worst that can happen is that they'll end up back here. So they'll back where they started, back doing it the WordPress way. But loading only jQuery core does require you keep the JavaScript up to date and make sure that you keep an eye on jQuery development just to make sure that you're not using any deprecated functions. Now, loading JavaScript in the footer is one thing, but loading it asynchronously also tells the browser to get on with rendering and to just deal with the JavaScript when the file is downloaded, and also not to worry about file order. So the first script can run last, the last script can run first. And asynchronous JavaScript simply relies on adding an async attribute to the script tag. And with that attribute that you can see on the third last line there, the browser just deals with making it asynchronous. And in WordPress, it's possible to run a filter to add this attribute. A script loaded asynchronously is easier to maintain, I find, if it's entirely self-contained. So if you don't need to support older browsers, then you may want to move away from using a library. jQuery was and is so good that many of the features that it has have become part of the spec, and they're in browsers by default. They just work a little differently. So in this example, the script with the handle pwcc scripts is self-contained, so I can run it asynchronously. The same applies for picture fill. I can load that asynchronously. And Jetpack's device resolution detection script if you happen to run Jetpack. And the final step is to just apply this filter that you've written so that, as you can see there in the last line, and that basically does the trick. Now, asynchronous JavaScript can run and be loaded in the HTML header. So we can do basically do the reverse that I just showed you for the jQuery change. Each of the scripts that load asynchronously, we assign them to group 0, the HTML header. The async attributes supported in your more modern browsers, so IE 10 Plus and basically everything else. So I've made some notes about that on the URL on the screen at the moment. So let's learn a little bit about how browsers make requests. When a device makes a request, there are actually 2 round trips to make, but diagrams are boring. So let's switch to the command line. First, the browser establishes the connection and the server replies. That's the first round trip. Then the browser tells the server the document it wants and the protocol, HTTP 1.1. And it also needs to name the site that it's on, the URL, because multiple sites can sit on one host. And the server responds with the document. Then, having requested the document, we need to get the style sheet. So again, we request the file and the browser responds. So to get the style sheet, we've made now 3 round trips. And the server only, but until the CSS file is loaded, the browser blocks rendering of the page. It's synchronous. It could load the CSS file asynchronously, but we end up with something a little bit like this. Text is available instantly, but that's quite a jarring flash of unstyled content. Isn't this beautiful? It's inline CSS. There's a general rule that no file over 4K should ever be inlined. However, it's a little bit more nuanced than that. On the first load, a site's CSS file is never going to be cached by the browser. So inlining the entire CSS file, or most of it, is going to give visitors the perception of a faster performing site and a better performing site. So, and that's because they don't need to wait for that second HTTP request. And to take advantage of browser caching, it does help if you also load the CSS file externally, as you normally would. But browsers don't have a async option for CSS files, so you need to load the file using JavaScript. And the Filament group have a tool just for that purpose, which they've creatively called Load CSS. So to make use of Load CSS, is going to take a little bit of work. It starts with registering the CSS file as you normally would. And it's important to note that I'm registering the file, not enqueuing it. The difference being that registering a file makes it known to WordPress. Enqueuing it makes it known to WordPress and also outputs it in the visitor's browser. We then need to run a test to see if the CSS file is cached in the user's browser. And if it is, we just enqueue the file as we normally would. So that goes in there as an external reference. And if the file isn't cached, we prepare to inline the CSS. And then in the header of the document, we again check if the file is cached, and if it isn't, we just output the inline CSS. Now, I've switched fairly seamlessly here into pseudocode. There is no file is CSS file cached. Functions is CSS file cached. And there's no way of testing for it. But it would be really handy if there was. But I'd quite like to fly, so I can't do that either. However, fortunately, Airbus have invented the A380, so I don't need to fly. This is close enough. So let's do the same thing and invent a way to test if a CSS file is cached in the visitor's browser. So the browser can cache the CSS. We need to load it externally using load CSS, which I showed you the link of before. And as I mentioned, this loads the file asynchronously, so we're not undoing any of our hard work and the gains from inlining it. And as part of asynchronously loading the CSS, we need to run the function to indicate the file is cached. And this is it. It's a simple function that just sets a cookie to in the visitor's browser so that you can record the file as cached. I like to set the value of the cookie to the version number I've got for the CSS file so that I can always check that it's up to date. And then this mysterious is CSS file cached function becomes this. It checks that the cookie exists and makes sure that the cookie returns the right value. If it is, the file is likely cached in the visitor's browser. If it's not, then I know to inline the CSS. So when a visitor first comes to a site, the HTML looks something like this with inline CSS. But on subsequent page loads, the HTML changes to something apparently more sensible, a reference to an external style sheet and specifying favicons. And while I've gone through some pseudocode today, I've actually put some working code online at the URL here. Google Fonts and Typekit and FontDeck mean that we've all become incredibly familiar with the font face rule. And you all will have seen sites that look like this. The site is loaded, but the font has not. And you probably see it on a bus or a train. As a user, it's incredibly frustrating. Looking at something like this, it's easy to see why web page tests and the other performance testing tools return visual progress. Because basically when the font loads and blocks rendering, font loads last, this graph is inverted. So there's a flash of invisible text. And it pretty much runs counter to the roots of the web. When browsers were first developed, it was deemed important to show the content first, the text. And then while the user was reading the content, the assets would load around it. And what we have here is exactly the opposite. Images without text, sort of disconnected from meaning, a bit like pom-poms without cheerleaders. What we are aiming for is exactly the opposite, meaning without the decorative bits. First, just the text loads, then the images and smaller assets to provide a little bit of additional meaning. All this, mind you, is just showing up in the standard unadorned browser fonts. Helvetica, Arial, Verdana if you're feeling a little bit nostalgic, all showing up as a flash of unstyled content. And finally, the styled text shows in the font face that you designed the site around. And it's actually quite easy to do, but Google Fonts, which is the most common provider, doesn't show the code by default. You just need to select the JavaScript option and use that to load your fonts. FontDeck and Typekit both recommend asynchronous code by default, but you do need to make sure that your code snippets are up to date. We could also just occasionally just design a site to use standard browser fonts. But the important step is getting your PageSpeed score up and your site performant is to let browsers be browsers and let them load the content first, the way it was intended. Look, I'm not going to lie, I'm not necessarily a big fan of pin, star, favourite, warble, me on social media buttons. Warble sounds plausible, so let's keep it. You will have all seen something that looks a little bit like this, which is kind of desperate, really. But even when it's more sensible, apparently, it's still a little bit full on. Google, Facebook, Reddit, Twitter and LinkedIn. It's not entirely uncommon. So let's focus on one and one only. The Facebook like button. Now, in that screenshot there, that number's not chosen at random. The script that the Facebook like button loads, in fact, any Facebook social media widget, is 52.8 kilobytes gzipped. And to give you an idea of how big that is, the Facebook like button is 56 bytes per pixel, to which I'd say kind of not much, because I was taught to be a nice boy, and nice boys don't use that many four-letter words in public. Do you know what makes a really nice like button? This. It's a link. Visitors to your site can just click a link and it takes them to Facebook where they can like your page. It doesn't need any JavaScript. It certainly doesn't need in excess of 50K. And sort of in about 15 minutes with about 40 lines of CSS, this is what a like button looks like in code. I did not cross-browser debug this at all. I know that it looks pretty rancid in Firefox, but the point is that I have a starting point with 40 lines of code. That's exciting. I'm magnetic. So I have a starting point if I ever need something in production. What I do though is if I was using like buttons, and as I said, I don't work on client sites anymore, so please never again. I'd then on the window load event replace the CSS and HTML version with the official button so that people get that interaction that they're used to. And here it is. Oh well. So finally, let's talk a little bit about advertising. If your client's producing content, advertising is often a necessary evil. And a few years ago, you may remember this, a number of websites went down at the same time. A List Apart, Zeldman's personal site, The Daily Report, of which I have 2 screenshots. Gruber's site, Daring Fireball, where he writes about how bad the web is because he doesn't understand how to make it work. And Dribble. Actually, no, that's not true. Dribble didn't go down. It was the only one in this sort of group of sites. And what was this group of sites, did this group of sites have in common? This, an ad, or ads, all by the same advertising network. And this is the code that this advertising network gets people to use. It inserts an ad and it uses document write, which is one of the slowest and most inefficient methods in JavaScript. It's going to ruin your performance. And then what it does is it inserts a script in such a way that it blocks rendering. So if the ad network server goes down, so does the site. And most ad networks use code very similar to this, in a way that blocks rendering and harms the perceived performance for the visitor. And in terms of ad networks, this site is not alone. So when Gruber inserts his ad code where the ad occurs, if the network goes down, his site stops loading there, but it doesn't load the ad either. and you can't see any of his content. So this is what Dribble did a little bit differently. Rather than blindly following the ad network's insert code, they did it properly. They put a div containing the ad right in the footer of the document and just hit it. And then they ignored the default ad network code and they loaded it asynchronously. So when the ad network in question went down, they were able to still load their site around it. The advertising didn't cripple the site and it didn't annoy their visitors. And also, Dribble were kind enough to, in a blog, put the code that they use in a blog post. So if you do a search, you'll be able to find it on Google. But it's also something that you can probably adapt for a number of other ad networks. All this is a good start for getting your site to load quicker, but is saving a few seconds here or there actually worth the effort? When I relaunched my site with something that loaded quicker, I noticed a change in the articles that were getting traffic. For years, the most popular article on my blog was about inserting the WordPress comments reply script, which was kind of frustrating because I'd publish a new blog post and day after day, week after week, this post from 2009 would be the most trafficked. Since the relaunch, a post on IE conditional comments around the HTML tag is getting the most traffic, which again is still slightly frustrating because it's from last year, but in January it was getting no traffic at all. And with a faster site, the post in question is now ranking second for its keywords. The other posts are still getting just as much traffic as before, but I'm getting more traffic overall. And I'm experimenting basically because I'm curious. But if you're making a client site, things like this translate to real, actual financial results. But I know that I have more to do. I could set up a CDN, I could use object caching, I could tune the server, but servers are hard, so I've been sweeping that under the carpet to deal with. But right at the start of this talk, I showed you how to measure the effect of a change using web page test. And measuring the effect of any change is the best way of working out if you're doing the right thing. Because people will talk about best practice. I've stood in spots very similar to this and spoken about best practice with some quite firm views. But if you don't actually measure the results of any change, it's just following reckons. By testing a change and ignoring best practice, you'll find out what works best in your particular circumstances. And you may make money as a result. So thank you very much. We've still got a few minutes for questions.
We're just going to take some questions and I'll just...
So there's a number of plugins.
Sorry, there's a number of plugins that can handle Minify CSS and put the script in the footer. Would you consider the bloat from the plugin outweighs the benefit of the speed?
I can't remember the name of the plugin, but I tried one of them that concatenated and minified and all of that, and went on and tested it to see what happened, and the site was running slower as a result. So I decided against using that plugin. But really, you can do all that sort of stuff when you're building the site. You can just have a build tool that when you update your server, it minifies the CSS, it minifies the JavaScript for you, and that is going to be better because you're only doing it once. You don't need to have a plugin, go and check, see if the site's been updated, and then decide to reminify, maybe miss it. You're doing the work and you're triggering the update of the minified file. Up the back.
Thank you. Thanks, Peter. Really enjoyed that talk. I'm curious if you've looked into any of the work that's been done on HTTP2 and how that solves some of the async hacks and fixes that you've put in for script loading and the like.
I've vaguely looked at it, but that's, again, server's hard. 'Cause I'm a front-end guy who just knows sort of enough back-end stuff to be dangerous. Yeah, so I know that it uses the same connection to get the CSS and download the CSS. So you're not waiting for that second connection to get a style sheet. So sort of the worst that's going to happen, I figure, is that you're wasting a little bit of bandwidth by having that inline CSS and then firing it off and loading it asynchronously externally. So it won't damage performance as HTTP2 is adopted into browsers if you're running it. But for the time being, we haven't got it, so let's deal with the present.
I'm also going to put a vote in for the server side of things. Speedy today, which is implemented in Firefox and Chrome, achieves like the majority of the things that HTTP2 does. So like be able to load multiple files without performance penalty, which is traditionally solved by minifying, which is cumbersome.
Yeah.
So I actually think it's worthwhile, for people to try and find a host or even consider creating a VPS where they can have, say, a server like Nginx or which supports the Speedy, so that everyone can get performance increase without requiring, recoding of themes, using all these tricks, which, of course are very ingenious in their own way, but, can create, in my opinion, a maintenance headache, especially if other people aren't aware of them and, they might create dependency issues.
So that's where I think using sort of a build tool to minify and sort of automate the work that you can automate, so that is going to help as well, so that people don't need to necessarily know about it, because you've just got something that runs when you deploy to do all the minification and automate all of that. It also keeps your Git repo clean. I, by the way, don't do this. This is a preach, not do situation, because the corner of the web that I control, I'm the only guy that works on it. At work we do have deploy tools and things like that to automate this stuff, but for sort of where I've been experimenting, I don't need it.
I found when I looked at PageSpeed analysis that often the bit that takes way too long is DNS. Any ideas?
Use a fast DNS provider. There's various DNS providers, and some of them will take a while. Some of them are slow. Some of them are a lot quicker because they're networked. So yeah, just use a fast DNS provider.
Any suggestions?
Use a fast no, no suggestions.
Anything that's on the Anycast network will basically have very similar speed, I think. So like DNS Made Easy, Easy DNS, like Amazon, Rapid for free. There's heaps of options.
Anycast is that.
Anycast is like a big global
And-
network. So
And I know that WordPress.com has quite a fast response time with the DNS testing tools, because they got all these DNS testing tools and started testing their DNS and realised that it needed an improvement. So if you're using WordPress.com, then that's something that that has been solved for you.
Peter, we just have another question over here.
Hello. I was wondering, I've seen on a couple of sites that they, like Smashing Magazine, that they actually divide the style sheet into two parts, while the first part is loaded inline and they use it for the content that's above the fold, so what the user sees when he loads the site. And then the second half, or like second part of the style sheet, they load classical way, and it styles the rest of the page. That's not seen immediately, but do you have any ideas how to implement this? Because
The Filament Group have got a grunt tool that will do that for you. So I can't remember the name of it, but if you if you go to the Filament Group's GitHub repo, they've got a grunt tool in there that will help you split your file into two. My CSS file, when it's gzipped, is sort of fairly small. I can't remember the exact number, but the entire page was under 14K, which is a magic number for a round trip. You'll need a second, basically you need a second trip to the server if your site is over 14K. It depends on configuration and a number of other things. So my entire setup was under that, so I didn't worry about adding the grunt tool to just do the key CSS first.
I was just going to say, if anyone's interested in that, the approach is called critical CSS.
Critical CSS, thank you.
Critical CSS.
So, and yeah, that's the... So if you Google that and the Filament Group, they'll lead you to that.
Any other questions? We've got time for one more. No? So if everyone could say thank you to Peter for his fantastic talk.
Thank you.